I want to start out by introducing our next speaker, who has one of the most inspiring titles I've ever seen. Dr. Deborah McGuinness is the Tetherless World Senior Constellation Chair and Professor of Computer and Cognitive Science at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. So welcome, Dr. McGuinness. Thank you.
Thanks. So thrilled to be here today, and I love having inspiring titles. And I was just telling some people in the room, I'm guessing that I'm the only card-carrying ontologist in the room, and I'm going to talk about ontologies to help support integration and making better decisions. So everybody wants to make better decisions. They might be better, faster, smarter, and of course we need good data, but good data is really not enough. So there, does that work? Oh, I got to do it up here. So you're not going to guarantee good decisions just from having good data. And basically, we need to integrate the data. So this article is a nice description of some things that we need to have. We have to have a flexible database design or schema design. We have to have a controlled vocabulary, so a set of words that we're going to agree to use. And we have to understand what those words mean, and that's where ontologies come in. And we need to know where we got the data and where we got the terminology. So my main mission here is to make sure that we all are aware of ontologies and we think about them in our architectures, because we need to have definitions of terms if we're going to talk and use the same terms so that we understand what each other mean. And if you don't have some kind of vocabulary that you understand, a controlled vocabulary is just a set of terms that we're going to use. Might be an extensible set of terms. We're going to have a tough time doing data integration, and we're going to have a tough time reproducing things if we don't use shared definitions. And it's hard to reuse stuff if we don't know where it came from. So does everybody know what an ontology is? Does anybody in the room not think they know what an ontology is? Okay, I figured there would be some. So at a high level, it's just a computer understandable definition of meaning or terms. So it specifies the terminology, the relationships between those terms, and then something that's going to distinguish the terms from each other. And this is a spectrum that came out of a meeting at the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence a while ago, a 99 panel where a bunch of us ontology experts got together and said, wow, this is an overused term, overloaded term. People mean everything from just a catalog of terms all the way up to these beautiful higher order logic descriptions of what terms mean. And we all want to be on the right side of this red line where we can count on the meaning. If you're a subclass of a higher level thing like a mammal, if you're a subclass of a lower level thing like a human, you better be a subclass of the higher level thing like a mammal. So I can have a formal ISA relationship between the two. This is where I can count on inference. Over here is where I may be able to count on inference. So we want to get the terminology and definitions of those terms in ways that computers are going to be able to understand. And then I'm going to talk about two things here. And my take-home message is ontologies are going to help enable FAIR. We heard Linda talk about FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, because they're going to help people understand what the terms mean. So we're going to have to build those ontologies. And it's part of a big process. I'm going to talk about pieces of that process. And I'm going to exemplify it first within CHEAR because I run the data science core within the data center. So Mount Sinai has the prime and RPI has the sub because we needed some ontology expert there. And so how am I going to build that ontology? And then how am I going to use it to support my backend, to support my smart backend that can help do intelligent or appropriate data retrieval? So Chris, for example, runs the biostatistics core in that program. So how am I going to make sure that she knows what she's getting or her team knows what they're getting when they do those queries? So the big thing that we do is we look at what our starting points are. Another take-home message is never build from scratch unless you have an incredibly good reason, because there's a ton of really good starting points. Actually, when I started doing ontologies 30 years ago, this was really not the case. There were some good starting points. Now the curse and the blessing is there's a ton of good starting points, many of which NIH has funded for years. So let's figure out where we can reuse them. And let's figure out, don't boil the ocean, don't take everything. Let's figure out what we're trying to do, get some use cases. So what questions are you trying to answer? How might you go about answering them? What are my starting points? In CHEAR, there was actually a pretty nice program call. They identified some number of resources that we looked at. We identified some. There's a lot of things that the data comes in templates. Those templates are actually the foundation of the terms that you're going to put in your ontology, because you're going to have to interact with them. We get data dictionaries and codebooks, those column headers, also good starting points. And then there's more things here, but these are the ones that we mainly used to build the ontology for CHEAR. And when I say build that ontology, despite the fact that we published a CHEAR ontology, my team really only generated maybe 10% new words, because what we mainly did is figured out what pieces of existing ontologies we wanted to reuse and how we're going to map to them. And the mapping is a challenge. So how are we going to put those things together? And then, of course, because I'm a semantics person, I've got a lot of tools that help figure out what our starting points are, help figure out how we can automatically ingest, and help figure out when that automatic ingest might look suspicious. So where do we want to focus the human expert's brain cells, and where can we save them time? So we figure out what our starting points are. We do some things like semantically extract, transform, and load. We build this ontology, and then we use it to annotate things so that we can not only find studies that might have the data that we're looking for, but actually find the data itself. And so in the back, I'm only going to show you snippets of the back, but in the back, there's a relatively sophisticated knowledge graph, which is just bits of information with labeled arcs between them, and the labels are all in an ontology where I know what the terms mean. And then that can power things like search and precision download. So I want to do things like support browsing, searching, pooling. Chris and Lance both mentioned this in their background. And actually do more sophisticated things like help derive values. So I might want to do, I have to support mapping between terms. And so, for example, I might get two studies that have a lot of granularity about any particular thing. Here I'm showing mother's level of education. One of the studies had a lot of granularity, one had a little, but at least they both have mother's education. And there's actually quite a bit of overlap in the string that they're using to label, but lots of times there's not. Like P1 might be a column header. So how am I going to map that in? And then if I want to retrieve things, studies that have at least some information about level of education. And then if I go into detail, I might see how the PI has actually determined a value. So for example, technical post-junior college. I didn't know what that was, but there's a description of that. So we're going to also use the ontology to form decisions about variables that might be combined. So I might want some information about birth outcomes. And so in some study, I might have a Fenton-weighted z-score that can be calculated from these variables and a chart. Or I might just calculate it myself if I've got those measurements. I can also use the ontology to help do integrity checking. So one study, not in CHEAR, but in a different, in a Gates Foundation study, I got a bunch of data that had APGAR scores above 10 when my range in my ontology said it's not supposed to go above 10. So I can at least say, hey, somebody go look at this because the data doesn't match what my schema is telling me it should contain. And I can also help expose implicit information and help find links. So that's just a little bit of background about some of the things that I can do. This CHEAR ontology for the Child Health Exposure Analysis Repository. So I love this project when I came in. I have to build a terminology that covers everything that anybody that the child could be exposed to, or anybody that contributed genetics could be exposed to, usually the mother, and any health outcome, which is, quite a bit of stuff. And this was a snapshot from actually a little while ago, just from some pilot studies that we were using. And we also did, when I first started working with the epidemiologists, I said, you and I together have identified all these background ontologies. What if I just try to pull them in and start doing some mappings? And we started doing that. And then the lead epidemiologist looked at what we had pulled in and said, I'm never going to use that and that and that and that. So we said, okay, we're going to use the things that we know we're going to need for this. And so we kind of did a bottom-up selection out of the ontologies that we knew we wanted to reuse. And we did that from a set of pilot studies that were kind of representative of what we expected to see. And so we've got a bunch of epidemiological attributes, a lot of different sample types, assay types, instruments. And then we pulled in, this is some of the ontologies that we used. So there was the semantic science integrated ontology integrates itself about 8 or so pretty well used ontologies. So that's a foundation. PROV is the World Wide Web Consortium's recommended standard for provenance on the web. So all our provenance is compatible with that. Haskell Human Aware Scientific Observations ontology also integrates about 8 or so pretty well used, pretty long-lived ontologies. And then these are all, I think every single one of them is NIH funded, pretty long-lived, pretty big, like chemical entities of biological interest, RefMet, the metabolites. So we're compatible with all of these, and we pulled in the pieces of that we would use. And actually, the screenshot that Linda showed from BioPortal showed a tiny bit of that ontology, that none of which, I think, on her map, was something that my team generated. It was all information that we pulled in. However, like for Kebi, we went back to them and said, wow, there's a few items that CHEAR needs that aren't in your ontology. We'll put them in the CHEAR ontology today, but over time, please get them in Kebi, and you guys maintain them. You people who actually know the domain should maintain them rather than the computer scientists maintaining them. So we have like the temporary holding place for the things that CHEAR needs until the reference ontologies actually get them. And then you don't really need to know the side of it, but then we use foundations, like we use an open source laboratory information management system that our lab geeks are kind of comfortable with, that interface to do some of the maintenance. We have a semantic extract, transform, and load that pulls things in from spreadsheets so that you reduce the opportunities for human error, less humans in the loop as long as you have good processes, has at least more consistency and over time higher quality. And then we support the browsing. So behind this, there's things like our children. This guy, Joe is a child who is a human. He's got a relationship to a parent, in this case, a mother. Connected to an instance in a foundational ontology, the SCIO-human, semantic science integrated ontology, and then some things that we needed to connect to, like education level. We have epidemiological measurements as well as many other things. And then we get these data dictionaries and code books. So these things have headings, GAGE. Well, I've got to map that to something. Or actually, here again, I'm mapping the ID to a human who's connected to things. We've got a gestational age in this particular code book. It was in days, just simple things like knowing between whether the units are days or weeks, so that we can get these mappings done into the background ontology so that we know when we're using terms, whether we need to do just a simple unit conversion, and what the terms actually mean. And I've got a lot of references sprinkled throughout. This reference talks about the semantic data dictionary approach. One of the things that I love about this is I, the computer scientist, I'm not doing the population of the semantic data dictionaries and the mappings. The people who actually know the domain, in this case, the epidemiologists are doing it, and then our tools are pulling that in a consistent way. And again, you don't need to look at the details of this, but you've got to have syntax behind the scenes. So the column headers connect everything, and all these labels, all the links are labeled, and I connect into whether it's the CHEAR ontology or the semantic science integrated ontology or other external ontologies. And then this helps me power a search. This is kind of the geeky front end to the human-aware data acquisition framework. And the only things that I'm going to highlight, unless people ask questions, are the study search and the data search. But I want to be able, and actually, there is a lot of security stuff on the side, so I can see this because I'm an admin. So I have privileges to see all the data. But there's embargo periods, and there's team-based security so that only the people who put the data in and who have permission to get to the data can get there. And actually, I'm not going to show any real data because I don't have permission to show it in a broad audience. But this would allow people to make questions. This question was a paraphrase of what Chris Jennings said I want to look at in one analysis. So get me some properties, get me the data from any study that I've got loaded. Actually, first find me the studies that actually might have this kind of content. And I do that off of the metadata before I've got the data. And then later I can do a data search saying, get me what you've loaded. And in this case, you might want to get on the child, the birth weight, the gender, gestational age at birth. I might want to get some properties of the mother. And then she was doing a meta-analysis. So get me studies that have these meta values. And then I can retrieve. Oh, and actually, oops, sorry, back. There. This is the study faceted search that I've only got two studies loaded, two pilot studies loaded. And it shows the terms that I can use to retrieve based on. And this is compatible with the NHANES terminology. So hopefully, a lot of people, at least the epidemiologists, said this would be a good vocabulary to expose. But we wanted to make it the vocabulary compatible with what people are accustomed to. And so I can retrieve the studies that are likely to have that content and the actual data and then download it. So I got a 2 minutes, so I took a little longer than I expected. And that actually is an ontology-enabled search and browse. But I don't want to just do that. I actually want to make cognitive agents. And actually, I'm doing that in a different program with the AI Horizons Network at IBM, where we're trying to answer questions like, how can we enhance population and individual health? And how do we integrate across this whole spectrum of genomics to population health? And within that, I've got my ontologies at the center, not surprisingly, because I'm the ontologist, but I pull in from literature, databases, public databases. I have my cognitive agents up here helping people do decision support, but I'm also making queries out to my statistical reasoners, my machine learning, my deductive reasoners. And the initial target of the program that I'm leading here is trying to enable the physician of the future, the precision health physician of the future. In this case, we were doing clinical oncologists first, but we want to help them actually figure out how they can make better decisions. And it's powered by back-end. This is a knowledge graph. In this case, we pulled in drugs, proteins, and disease interactions. And then we weighted the links on the method that they use to encode that information and how likely it, by biostatisticians' analysis, thought that it would be reliable. And then how do we find outcomes? Here we were looking for potential retargetings of drugs, but we're expanding this to be genomics-aware cancer care. So if I've got some set of interesting genomic information, some of which I know something about, some of which I know nothing about, and I'm the clinician of the future, how do I get the information to figure out which is important, and how does that connect to either best practice or clinical trials that are going on. So I'm going to leave with a set of recommendations. And actually, I've got these two pictures because ontologies can really support, they're the only thing that I'm aware of, the best hammer to try to help with FAIR. Try to make things accessible, interoperable, reusable, and findable, because we're using terms that the computer can understand. So, and actually, I didn't show it much, but they can help move across different levels of abstractions from genomic to population health. So please use them in your architectures. But notice that this is the ontology just over here, and this bigger thing for how I'm going to build it and use it. And this is the ontology here because it's the glue between things, but my decision support is really up here. So don't build them from scratch. Selectively and thoughtfully reuse existing best practice ontologies and engage experts in figuring out which pieces to pull out and how to put them together and how to map them. And actually, I'm going to echo, I think, every speaker before me. The ecosystem and diverse teams are really the main key to success here. So let's enable the next generation together. And if you don't know about ontology engineering, there's a book coming out, and tons of people helped with this. Sure.